Case 1. Kimberly Fry, August 10, 2009, Washington County, Rhode Island. There are moments in a community's history that refuse to be forgotten. Moments that become embedded in the collective memory of a place. Not because people choose to dwell on them, but because what happened was so far outside the boundaries of what any community expects that the mind cannot simply move past it. The case of Kimberly Fry, prosecuted in Washington County Superior Court in the state of Rhode Island, is one of those moments. It is a case that began inside a home in North Kingstown on an August evening in 2009, and it ended with a conviction that the court record preserves in permanent, unambiguous detail. North Kingstown is a coastal community in Washington County, Rhode Island, situated on the western shore of Narragansett Bay. It is a town of approximately 26,000 people, a mix of suburban residential neighborhoods, historic village centers, and waterfront areas that define much of southern Rhode Island's character. It is the kind of community where families put down roots, where children ride bikes in the neighborhood, where a summer evening in August carries with it the ordinary warmth of a community at rest. On August 10, 2009, that ordinary August evening became the setting for something that would find its way into the Washington County Superior Court record and remain there permanently. The circumstances that preceded the events of that evening were, on their surface, the kind of domestic situation that occurs in households across the country every single day. A child, an 8-year-old girl, the daughter of Kimberly Fry, did not want to take a bath. That is a moment that parents everywhere recognize. Children resist bath time. They negotiate, they delay, they express their preferences loudly and with conviction. It is one of the most ordinary, unremarkable friction points in the relationship between parents and young children. In the vast majority of households, that friction resolves the way it always has, through patience, through firmness, through the ordinary navigation of a parent exercising authority and a child eventually complying. It does not escalate into something that ends with law enforcement and a medical examiner and a criminal prosecution. In Kimberly Fry's household, on August 10, 2009, it did. The evidence introduced at trial and incorporated into the Washington County Superior Court record established what occurred in that North Kingstown home following the argument over the bath. Kimberly Fry subjected her 8-year-old daughter to physical force, specifically manual strangulation and asphyxiation, that resulted in the child's death. The medical findings confirmed the cause and manner of death with the specificity that forensic examination provides. The investigation conducted by Rhode Island law enforcement moved to Kimberly Fry as the responsible party with the clarity that the evidence demanded. Kimberly Fry was arrested and charged. The case proceeded through Washington County Superior Court. The charge of second-degree murder in Rhode Island reflects a legal finding that the conduct resulted in a death caused through conduct demonstrating a level of criminal culpability that the law places in the most serious category of homicide offenses. Rhode Island's second-degree murder standard, applied in the context of the evidence documented in this case, captures the reality of what occurred in that North Kingstown home. A child lost her life at the hands of the person who was supposed to be her greatest protector. The trial proceeded. The prosecution built its case on the medical evidence, the investigative findings, and the circumstances documented by law enforcement in the aftermath of August 10, 2009. The jury evaluated everything before them, every piece of evidence, every witness, every argument from both sides, and returned a verdict. Kimberly Fry was convicted of second-degree murder in Washington County Superior Court. The conviction became part of the permanent record of Rhode Island's judicial system, a record that documents both what happened to that 8-year-old girl on an August evening in North Kingstown and the accountability that followed. The child at the center of this case was 8 years old. 8 years old is an age of remarkable development. Children at that age are in school, making friends, developing their own personalities, beginning to understand the world in increasingly sophisticated ways. They have opinions and preferences and a growing sense of who they are. They argue about bath time. They are, in every sense, children who deserve the full protection of every adult in their lives. This child deserved that protection most from the person who was supposed to provide it unconditionally. Washington County Superior Court ensured that what happened to her on August 10, 2009 was not minimized, excused, or allowed to pass without the full weight of criminal accountability. The conviction for second-degree murder stands as the permanent legal answer to what occurred in that home. Rhode Island has resources available for families in crisis. If you or someone you know is struggling and there are children in the home, please reach out before a situation reaches a point of no return. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely confidential. If this case moved you, please take a moment right now. Like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories deserve to be heard, and your support makes it possible for us to tell them. Case 2, Michelle Rothgeb, January 3, 2019, Kent County, Rhode Island. The legal and moral obligations that accompany the decision to adopt a child are among the most profound that any adult can undertake. Adoption is, at its core, a commitment, a formal, legally documented commitment made before a court and before the community to provide a child with the safety, the care, the medical attention, and the parental protection that every child deserves. When that commitment is broken, the legal system has a responsibility to respond with the seriousness that the betrayal demands. The case of Michelle Rothgeb, prosecuted in connection with the death of her 9-year-old adopted daughter in Warwick, Rhode Island, is a case about that broken commitment and about what the courts of Rhode Island did when confronted with the evidence of how completely and catastrophically it was broken. Warwick is Rhode Island's second-largest city, located in Kent County on the western shore of Narragansett Bay. It is a city of approximately 80,000 people, a substantial urban community with a significant residential population, a major regional airport, extensive commercial development, and the full range of social services and institutions that a city of that size supports. It is not a small, isolated community where things go unnoticed. It is a place with schools and medical facilities and neighbors and the ordinary infrastructure of an American city. And yet, in a home in Warwick, a 9-year-old child with cerebral palsy, a child who had been adopted, who was under the legal and moral care of Michelle Rothgeb, lived in conditions that investigators would describe in terms that challenge the ability of ordinary language to capture. The child at the center of this case had cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a neurological condition that affects movement, muscle tone, and motor skills, and that in many cases requires significant ongoing medical management, including the consistent administration of medications to control associated conditions such as seizures. Children with cerebral palsy often require more attentive and more specialized care than typically developing children, not less. Their medical needs are real, documented, and manageable with appropriate parental engagement and medical oversight. They are also children who, by virtue of their condition, may be less able to advocate for themselves, less able to communicate distress, and less able to seek help when the care they are receiving falls below the standard they need to survive. On January 3, 2019, that 9-year-old child did not survive. The circumstances documented by investigators in the aftermath of her death were addressed in the Kent County court proceedings that followed. Michelle Rothgeb had left her daughter, a child with cerebral palsy who required attentive supervision, particularly in situations involving water, unattended in a bathtub. The child remained in that bathtub for nearly 8 hours. She drowned. The investigation that followed the child's death produced findings that expanded the scope of what the court would be asked to evaluate. Investigators who examined the Warwick home documented conditions that reflected a sustained and serious failure of basic parental care. The home was found to be in a state that law enforcement and investigators described as covered in waste and refuse, conditions that no child, and certainly no child with the specific medical vulnerabilities of this 9-year-old, should have been living in. Beyond the physical conditions of the home, investigators established something with particular legal significance. Michelle Rothgeb had been withholding her daughter's seizure medication. A child with cerebral palsy who requires seizure medication to manage a documented neurological condition and who is not receiving that medication is a child in ongoing medical danger. Danger that has nothing to do with a single incident and everything to do with a sustained pattern of medical neglect. Michelle Rothgeb was charged in connection with her daughter's death and with the conditions documented in the home. Rather than proceeding to trial, she entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and to child cruelty. a combination of charges that addressed both the specific circumstances of the child's death and the broader pattern of neglect and mistreatment that the investigation had documented. The guilty plea was a formal, legal acknowledgement before the Kent County Court of Criminal Responsibility for what had been done to that 9-year-old girl. The case of Michelle Rothgeb raises questions that extend beyond the specific household in Warwick. Adopted children, particularly those with significant medical needs, interact with a range of institutions, schools, medical providers, social workers, adoption agencies that are, in theory, positioned to observe and respond to signs that a child's care is inadequate. The investigation in this case, and the conditions it documented, raise questions about what was visible and what was not, about what was reported and what was not, and about how the systems that are supposed to maintain oversight of children in these circumstances function in practice. Those are important questions that child welfare advocates in Rhode Island and across the country continue to press. What the Kent County Court record provides is the answer to the specific legal question: what accountability follows when the evidence establishes what it established in this case? The guilty plea to manslaughter and child cruelty is that answer. It is permanent. It is documented. And it carries the name of the child who deserved so much more than what she received in that Warwick home. If you know a child with special medical needs who may not be receiving appropriate care, please do not hesitate to contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Children with disabilities deserve the same protection and often need more of it. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this channel going and these stories in the light where they belong. Case 3, Jessaline Andrade, December 10th, 2021, Providence County, Rhode Island. The opioid epidemic has reshaped the landscape of criminal prosecution in Rhode Island in ways that were not anticipated when the crisis first began to accelerate in the early 2000s. What began as a public health emergency has, in case after case across the state, intersected with child welfare in ways that have forced prosecutors, judges, and juries to grapple with questions that sit at the intersection of addiction, negligence, and criminal accountability. The case of Jessaline Andrade, arising from events that occurred in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in December of 2021, represents one of the most serious outcomes of that intersection. A case in which a 2-year-old child lost his life, and a grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder. Pawtucket is a city in Providence County, Rhode Island, located on the northeastern border of the state adjacent to the city of Providence itself. It is a densely populated urban community with a long industrial history, the site of the first water-powered textile mill in the United States, and a contemporary population of approximately 75,000 people. Like many post-industrial New England cities, Pawtucket has navigated significant economic challenges over the decades, and those challenges have been compounded by the opioid epidemic that has affected communities across the region with particular severity. On December 10th, 2021, emergency responders were called to a Pawtucket apartment in connection with a medical emergency involving a very young child. What they found when they arrived would set in motion a criminal investigation that reached not just Jessaline Andrade, but also her boyfriend and an additional acquaintance. The child at the center of the emergency was 2 years old, Andrade's son. He did not survive. The medical examination conducted following his death established the cause as a fentanyl overdose. The investigation of the apartment that followed produced findings that were incorporated into the grand jury proceedings and that shaped the charges ultimately brought in Providence County. The apartment where this 2-year-old child had been living lacked basic furniture, the ordinary household items that define a functioning living space, and that, in a home with a toddler, represent the minimum baseline of a safe and stable environment. Beyond the absence of basic furnishings, investigators determined that the apartment was not being used primarily as a family residence. It was being used as a site for the manufacture and distribution of narcotics. A 2-year-old child was living in an apartment that was functioning as a drug operation. The implications of that finding are significant. A narcotics manufacturing and distribution site is not simply a place where drugs are present. It is a place where large quantities of controlled substances that, in the quantities associated with distribution operations, are present in forms and concentrations that are potentially lethal even with minimal exposure for a child of any age, and catastrophically dangerous for a 2-year-old, are actively being handled, processed, and stored. The presence of a toddler in that environment was not incidental. He lived there. He was in that environment every day. The grand jury that reviewed the evidence in this case returned an indictment for second-degree murder, not just against Jessaline Andrade, but against her boyfriend and an acquaintance who were also charged in connection with what had occurred. The decision to charge second-degree murder rather than manslaughter reflects the grand jury's assessment, based on the evidence presented, that the circumstances went beyond negligence and rose to the level of conduct demonstrating a reckless disregard for human life that Rhode Island law places in the murder category. The indictment of 3 individuals, not just the child's mother but also 2 others present in and associated with that apartment and its operations, reflects the investigative determination that the criminal responsibility for what happened to that 2-year-old child in Pawtucket on December 10, 2021, was shared across multiple people who had made choices that created the conditions in which he lost his life. A 2-year-old child deserves furniture. He deserves a home. He deserves to be the most important thing in the space where he lives, not an afterthought in an environment devoted to criminal enterprise. The Providence County Grand Jury's indictment is the formal legal statement that what happened to him in that Pawtucket apartment was not an accident that occurred in a normal household. It was the predictable and foreseeable consequence of choices made by adults who placed their own activities above the survival of a child. If you have concerns about a young child's living conditions, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. A child's environment tells a story, and sometimes that story needs someone outside the home to read it. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share this episode with someone who you think should know that these cases exist and that Rhode Island's courts are pursuing accountability in each of them. Case 4, Trisha Oliver, October 4, 2009, Providence County, Rhode Island. There is a moment at the center of the Trisha Oliver case that investigators, prosecutors, and child welfare professionals have returned to repeatedly in the years since the Providence County proceedings concluded. It is not a moment of action. It is a moment, extending across more than 12 hours, of deliberate inaction. A moment in which a 6-year-old boy was suffering from injuries of a severity that any person with any awareness of what was happening in that Pawtucket apartment could not have failed to recognize as a medical emergency. And a moment in which Trisha Oliver, rather than calling for help, was exchanging text messages with the person responsible for her son's injuries. That detail, the text messages, became one of the most legally and emotionally significant elements of the case that was built and resolved in Providence County. It transformed what might otherwise have been characterized as a parent too overwhelmed or too frightened to act into something that the court record addresses with stark clarity. A parent who was engaged, communicative, and capable of interaction with the outside world, while her 6-year-old son was actively, visibly, and fatally deteriorating in the same apartment. The case begins with an act of violence that Trisha Oliver did not commit, but that occurred in her home, in the presence of her child, at the hands of her boyfriend. The 6-year-old boy, Oliver's son, was subjected to severe physical harm that resulted in internal injuries of a critical nature. Specifically, the medical examination documented an injury to the child's intestine, a torn intestine resulting from the force applied to his body, that constitutes a life-threatening medical emergency requiring immediate surgical intervention. This is not the kind of injury that can be managed at home, that might improve on its own, or that a reasonable person could observe and conclude was not serious. It is an injury that produces symptoms, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, progressive deterioration, that are visible and unmistakable. Oliver's son exhibited those symptoms. He was vomiting. He was in visible distress. His condition was deteriorating over the course of the hours that followed the harm that had been inflicted on him. And for more than 12 hours, Trisha Oliver did not call emergency services. She did not take him to a hospital. She did not seek any form of medical assistance. What she did, during those more than 12 hours, was exchange dozens of text messages with her boyfriend, the person who had caused her son's injuries. The investigation recovered those messages. They became evidence. They documented, in real time, The communications that Oliver was having with the outside world while her son's condition moved from serious to fatal. The messages did not reflect a parent in a state of shock so profound that she could not function. They reflected a parent who was communicating, making choices, engaging with another person, while her child needed medical intervention that only the outside world could provide. The 6-year-old boy did not survive. By the time emergency services were finally contacted, the window for the intervention that might have saved him had closed. Trisha Oliver was charged in Providence County in connection with her son's death. The charge addressed her specific conduct, not the infliction of the initial harm, which was attributed to her boyfriend, but the 12-plus hours of failure to seek medical care that converted a survivable emergency into a fatal outcome. She entered a guilty plea to manslaughter. The guilty plea was a formal acknowledgement before the court of criminal responsibility for that failure, for the decision, extended across more than half a day, not to get her son the help he needed. The case of Trisha Oliver sits in a specific and important category within child fatality prosecution. Cases where a parent did not directly cause the harm to their child, but where their response, or their catastrophic failure to respond, to that harm constitutes independent criminal conduct. Rhode Island, like other states, has developed legal frameworks for holding parents criminally responsible not only for harm they directly cause, but for harm they allow to continue by failing to act. The manslaughter conviction in Oliver's case is an application of that framework, a judicial determination that the more than 12 hours of inaction, the text message exchanges, and the failure to seek help while a 6-year-old boy's condition became irreversible, constituted criminal negligence resulting in death. The child at the center of this case was 6 years old. He was old enough to be in school, old enough to have friends, old enough to have his own small world of interests and relationships and daily experiences. He was not old enough to get himself to a hospital. He was not old enough to call for help on his own behalf. He needed his mother to make that call. For more than 12 hours, she did not. Providence County's courts ensured that the legal record reflects both what happened to that 6-year-old boy and what the consequences were for the choices made in the hours that followed. The manslaughter conviction stands. His story is part of the permanent record. He is remembered here. If a child in your life is showing signs of distress or injury that aren't being addressed by the adults responsible for their care, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. You do not need certainty to make that call. You need only concern. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case in this documentary represents a child who deserved better, and a court system that, when given the evidence, delivered accountability. Case 5, Jocelyn Belmore and Stephen Gilchrist, November 19, 2017, Kent County, Rhode Island. The death of an infant is, in any context, one of the most devastating events that a community and a court system can be asked to confront. When that death occurs in circumstances that document not a single moment of failure, but an entire environment of sustained neglect, when the conditions in which that infant lived tell a story that goes far beyond any single decision and reflects a household in which the most basic requirements of infant care were consistently and completely absent, the legal and moral weight of what the courts are asked to address becomes even greater. The case of an 8-month-old infant girl who did not survive the conditions she was born into in Coventry, Rhode Island, and the criminal charges brought against Jocelyn Belmore and Stephen Gilchrist in Kent County, is that kind of case. Coventry is a town in Kent County, Rhode Island, one of the state's larger communities by geographic area, with a population of approximately 35,000 people spread across a landscape of residential neighborhoods, rural areas, and small commercial centers. It is a community that, like many Rhode Island towns, has felt the impact of the opioid epidemic that has affected communities across New England with particular force. On November 19, 2017, emergency responders were called to a home in Coventry. What they found when they arrived set in motion a Kent County criminal proceeding that addressed both the death of an 8-month-old infant and the conditions in which she had been living. The infant girl was unresponsive when emergency responders arrived. She was 8 months old. Despite the response of emergency medical personnel, she did not survive. The medical examination conducted following her death established the cause as a fentanyl overdose. An 8-month-old infant does not access fentanyl independently. An 8-month-old infant does not make choices about her environment. She was entirely dependent on the adults in her home for every aspect of her safety, for what she was exposed to, for what was accessible in her environment, for the conditions that surrounded her every moment of every day. The fentanyl that ended her life was present in her environment because of the adults in that home. The investigation of the Coventry residence that followed the infant's death produced findings that went beyond the immediate circumstances of the fentanyl exposure. Investigators documented the conditions throughout the home with the thoroughness that a case of this nature demands. What they found was a household environment that reflected a sustained and comprehensive failure of the basic standards of care that any infant requires. Animal waste was present throughout the home, not in isolated areas, but distributed through the living space in a way that spoke to conditions that had persisted over an extended period rather than resulting from a single lapse. Prescription drug bottles were found on a nightstand, the same nightstand where the infant's diapers were kept. Those bottles contained marijuana and Suboxone, stored in proximity to the supplies used to care for the baby. The picture that emerged from the investigation was of a home in which the needs and safety of an 8-month-old infant had been consistently subordinated to conditions created by adult choices about substance use. The fentanyl overdose that ended her life was not a random event occurring in an otherwise safe environment. It was the fatal intersection of a series of conditions of the home, conditions of adult behavior, conditions of the environment in which that infant was being raised, that had been building for the entire 8 months of her life. Jocelyn Belmore and Stephen Gilchrist both faced felony charges of child cruelty or neglect in Kent County in connection with the infant's death and the conditions documented in the home. The charges reflected the investigative determination that both adults in that household bore criminal responsibility for the environment in which the infant had been living and for the circumstances that led to her death. This case, like the Malloy and Dobbins cases from the main episode of Cold Case Hour, sits at the devastating intersection of the opioid epidemic and infant welfare. Across New England, the pattern has repeated itself with a frequency that public health officials, child welfare advocates, and law enforcement have documented and responded to with growing urgency. Households where substance use disorder has created conditions that are incompatible with the survival of very young children, resulting in tragedies that are at once foreseeable and preventable. The 8-month-old girl at the center of this Kent County case is one of the victims of that pattern, a child who never had the chance to grow beyond the environment into which she was born. The felony charges brought against both Jocelyn Belmore and Stephen Gilchrist in Kent County represent Rhode Island's legal system applying the accountability that the evidence demanded. An 8-month-old girl deserved a home that was safe, a home that was clean, a home in which the adults responsible for her care were present and capable of providing that care. She deserved every month and every year ahead of her. The Kent County proceedings are the formal legal record of what happened when those things were not provided. If you are struggling with substance use and there are infants or young children in your home, please reach out for help now. The SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357 is free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day. Please make that call before another family faces what this family faced. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment. Every subscriber helps this channel reach more people with stories that deserve to be heard. Case 6. Esther Pacheco, August 6, 2022, Providence County, Rhode Island. There is a category of criminal case that Rhode Island's courts, and courts across the country, encounter with a regularity that child safety advocates find deeply troubling. Cases in which the harm that comes to a young child is not the direct result of an adult's hands, but of an adult's absence. Cases where the question at the center of the legal proceedings is not what the parent did, but what the parent failed to do. Specifically, the failure to ensure that adequate, age-appropriate supervision was in place before leaving. The case of Esther Pacheco, arising from events that occurred at a Providence apartment complex on August 6, 2022, is a case of that kind. It is a case in which a 10-month-old infant drowned while his mother was absent from the home, and in which the only person present who might have been expected to help was a 9-year-old child who was never equipped or able to bear the responsibility that had been placed on him. Providence is the capital city of Rhode Island and the most populous city in the state, with a population of approximately 190,000 people. It is a city of distinct neighborhoods, significant institutional infrastructure, including major universities and healthcare systems, and a diverse, densely populated urban community. It is also a city that has experienced the full range of social challenges facing urban New England communities, including the housing pressures, economic stresses, and family instability that create the conditions in which tragedies like this one occur. On August 6, 2022, Esther Pacheco left her apartment complex in Providence. When she left, she did not arrange for adult supervision of her children. She left her 10-month-old infant in the care of her 9-year-old son. A 9-year-old child caring for a 10-month-old infant is not a supervision arrangement. It is, from the perspective of any child safety professional, an inherently unsafe situation, one in which the older child is being asked to perform a caregiving role that requires adult judgment, adult capacity, and adult physical ability to respond to emergencies, none of which a 9-year-old possesses regardless of how responsible or capable that child might be for their age. What followed reflects both the unpredictability of infant care and the predictable consequence of placing a 9-year-old in an impossible position. The 10-month-old infant soiled his diaper. The 9-year-old, faced with a situation he did not know how to handle and expecting his mother to return shortly, made a decision that reflected the limits of his understanding and his age. He placed the infant in a filled bathtub. He then went to lie down, presumably to wait for his mother's return. The infant drowned. The 9-year-old child in this case bears no criminal responsibility for what occurred. He was himself a child who was placed in a situation that no 9-year-old should ever be placed in, who did his best with the knowledge and capacity he had, and who has to live with the memory of what happened in that apartment. He is a victim of this situation, not a perpetrator of it. The legal proceedings in Providence County addressed that reality clearly. Esther Pacheco was charged with manslaughter in connection with her 10-month-old son's death. The charge addressed the specific conduct that the investigation identified as the source of criminal responsibility, the decision to leave a 10-month-old infant in the care of a 9-year-old child and to be absent from the home, creating the conditions in which the tragedy unfolded. Manslaughter through criminal negligence, the legal theory applicable in a case like this, does not require proof of intent to harm. It requires proof that the defendant's conduct fell so far below the standard of care that a reasonable person would have maintained that it constitutes criminal negligence. Leaving a 10-month-old infant without adult supervision, in the care of a 9-year-old, meets that standard. The Providence County proceedings in Esther Pacheco's case are part of a broader pattern of cases in which courts across Rhode Island and across New England have been asked to address the specific question of what constitutes adequate supervision of very young children. The answer, reinforced through case after case in the court records, is consistent. Infants and toddlers require adult supervision, not older sibling supervision, not neighbor supervision that is not specifically arranged. Not the hope that a parent will return before something goes wrong. Adult supervision, present and capable of responding to whatever a child's needs generate in any given moment. The 10-month-old infant at the center of this case deserved to have his mother present when his diaper needed changing. He deserved to have an adult in the home who could respond to what he needed. He was 10 months old, completely dependent, completely vulnerable, completely reliant on the adults in his life to make decisions that kept him safe. Those decisions were not made for him on August 6, 2022. The Providence County Court ensured that the record reflects that reality and that the accountability for it is assigned to the person whose choices created the conditions that led to his death. Please, if you need to leave your home, please ensure that any child in your care, particularly infants and very young children, are in the care of a responsible adult. The difference between a safe outcome and an irreversible tragedy can be a single decision made before you walk out the door. Please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Case 7, Mariah Ramos, February 21, 2017, Kent County, Rhode Island. Technology has transformed the landscape of criminal investigation in ways that were not anticipated even a generation ago. The smartphones that billions of people carry constantly, devices that record video, retain metadata, document location, and preserve communications, have become one of the most powerful sources of evidence in criminal prosecutions across the country. Cases that might previously have turned on conflicting accounts and the credibility of witnesses are now often resolved by the digital record that people create, sometimes without awareness of its evidentiary significance, in the ordinary course of their daily lives. The case of Mariah Ramos, prosecuted in connection with the death of her 7-month-old daughter in Warwick, Rhode Island, is a case in which that digital record, specifically cell phone videos recorded by Ramos herself in the hours before her daughter's death, became central to the legal proceedings that followed in Kent County. Warwick is, as noted in the context of the Michelle Rothgeb case earlier in this documentary, Rhode Island's second-largest city, located in Kent County on the western shore of Narragansett Bay. It is a city with extensive residential neighborhoods and a substantial population that includes families across the full range of economic circumstances. On February 21, 2017, emergency responders were called to a location in Warwick in connection with a 7-month-old infant girl who was unresponsive. The infant did not survive. The medical examination that followed established the cause of death as suffocation, specifically positional suffocation resulting from an adult rolling onto and coming to rest on top of the infant while in a deeply impaired state. The adult who was with the infant when this occurred was her father. The investigation established that the father was, at the time of the infant's death, severely impaired by a combination of fentanyl, cocaine, and methadone, a combination of substances that produces a level of sedation and physical incapacitation so profound that a person under their influence can lose the capacity for any purposeful movement or response. He rolled over onto his 7-month-old daughter and lost consciousness on top of her. She did not survive. The legal question that the Kent County proceedings addressed was not limited to the father's conduct. It extended to Mariah Ramos and to the decision she had made before leaving her 7-month-old daughter alone with him. That decision and the circumstances surrounding it were documented by evidence that came from Ramos's own phone. In the period before she left her daughter with the father, Ramos had recorded cell phone videos. Those videos captured the father's condition at the time, a condition that was, according to the investigation and the court proceedings, visibly and unmistakably that of a person who was completely incoherent. Not tired, not slightly impaired, completely incoherent. A person whose level of impairment was visible, documentable, and documented by the very person who then chose to leave a 7-month-old infant in his sole care. The videos that Ramos recorded became evidence. They established what she knew, or what any reasonable person reviewing those videos would have known, about the condition of the person she was leaving her daughter with. They established that the risk to the infant was not hidden or unknowable. It was observable and observed. And they established that despite that observation, Ramos made the choice to leave. Mariah Ramos was charged in Kent County in connection with her daughter's death. She entered a plea of nolo contendere, a Latin phrase meaning, I do not contest, to involuntary manslaughter. A nolo contendere plea has the same legal effect as a guilty plea in terms of the criminal conviction it produces, but it differs in that the defendant does not make a formal admission of guilt that can be used against them in subsequent civil proceedings. The involuntary manslaughter conviction reflects the court's determination that Ramos's conduct, leaving a 7-month-old infant in the care of a person whom she had documented on video as completely incoherent, constituted criminal negligence resulting in her daughter's death. The cell phone videos at the center of this case represent something that child safety advocates have pointed to repeatedly in the context of opioid-related child fatalities. The importance of making protective decisions about children based on the visible reality of the situation, not on assumptions about what might or might not happen in one's absence. Mariah Ramos did not need an expert to tell her that the person she was leaving her daughter with was impaired. She recorded it on her own phone. She documented it herself. And then she left anyway. Her 7-month-old daughter was the consequence of that choice. A 7-month-old girl who was in her first year of life, who was entirely dependent on the adults around her to ensure that the people responsible for her care were capable of providing it, paid for that choice with her life. Kent County's courts responded with the accountability that the evidence demanded. The involuntary manslaughter conviction is the permanent legal record of what happened in Warwick on February 21, 2017, and of the responsibility that was assigned for it. If you are in a situation where you need to leave a young child in someone else's care, please ensure that person is genuinely capable of providing safe care at that moment. If there is any doubt, any visible sign of impairment, any concern about the person's capacity, please find an alternative before you leave. That decision, made in that moment, is the difference between a child who is safe and a tragedy that cannot be undone. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment. We appreciate every one of you who watches these documentaries with us. Case 8, Tiffany Vanstone, August 14, 2024, Providence County, Rhode Island. Most of the cases examined in this documentary involve outcomes that were fatal. Children who did not survive the circumstances they were placed in by the adults responsible for their care. Case 8 is different in one important respect. The 5 children at the center of this case survived. They were found. They were removed. They are alive. But the circumstances in which they were found, documented by Johnston police officers who conducted a wellness check at a residence on August 14, 2024, were sufficiently serious and sufficiently dangerous that Rhode Island's legal system responded with 5 separate felony charges. The survival of these children does not diminish the gravity of what was documented in that home. It amplifies it, because it raises the question of how much longer those children could have continued to survive in conditions that law enforcement described in terms that make it clear how serious the situation was. Johnston is a town in Providence County, Rhode Island, located directly adjacent to the city of Providence on its western boundary. It is a community of approximately 28,000 people, a residential town with close connections to the Providence metropolitan area and a character that blends suburban and small-town elements. On August 14, 2024, Johnston police received information that prompted a wellness check at a residence in the town. Officers who responded to that wellness check found 5 children inside the home. The youngest of those children was 7 weeks old, a newborn, at the age when every aspect of an infant's environment is critical to survival and healthy development. What officers documented inside that residence was a set of conditions that the charges subsequently filed against Tiffany Vanstone in Providence County reflect in their seriousness and specificity. The interior of the home was filled with substantial accumulations of garbage and refuse. Moldy food was present. Animal waste from cats living in the home was present throughout the living space, in conditions that suggested it had not been addressed over an extended period. The cats themselves were found with no visible food or water, animals living in the same conditions of neglect as the children who shared the space with them. 5 children, including a 7-week-old infant, were living in that environment. A 7-week-old infant's immune system is not equipped to manage the bacterial and environmental challenges presented by conditions of that kind. A 7-week-old infant's respiratory system is not equipped to manage the air quality that those conditions produce. A 7-week-old infant who is living in an environment like the one documented in that Johnston home is a child whose health is being compromised every day, in ways that may not produce a single dramatic medical emergency, but that accumulate over time into outcomes that can be serious and lasting. Tiffany Vanstone was arrested and charged with 5 felony counts of cruelty to or neglect of a child, 1 count for each of the 5 children found in that home. 5 felony counts. The structure of the charges reflects the investigative and legal determination that each child in that home was independently a victim of the conditions documented there, that the harm was not a single incident affecting one child, but a sustained environmental failure affecting all 5 children simultaneously and continuously. The case of Tiffany Vanstone is, in certain respects, the most preventable of all the cases in this documentary. The children survived. The conditions that endangered them were visible enough that a wellness check produced findings sufficient to support 5 felony charges. The question that cases like this always generate is the same question that child welfare advocates have been pressing for decades. How long had those conditions existed before August 14, 2024? What was visible before the wellness check? What opportunities existed to intervene earlier, to identify the situation, to respond in a way that might have improved the conditions for those 5 children before they reached the state that officers documented when they arrived? Those questions do not have easy answers. They rarely do. But they are the right questions to ask, and the Providence County proceedings against Tiffany Vanstone are the beginning of the legal process that will eventually provide its own set of answers about what the evidence establishes and what accountability follows. 5 children are alive. That is the outcome that matters most in this case. But alive is not the same as unaffected. Children who spend their earliest years in environments of serious neglect carry the impact of those environments with them, developmentally, psychologically, physically. The 5 felony charges filed in Providence County are the legal system statement that what those 5 children experienced in that Johnston home was not acceptable and will not pass without consequence. If you are concerned about the living conditions of children in a home near you, if what you can see from the outside or what you know from contact with those children suggests that conditions inside may not be safe, please contact the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth and Families at their hotline, or reach out to the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. You do not need to be certain. You need only to be concerned. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share it with someone in your community. These are Rhode Island cases, Rhode Island children, and Rhode Island courts delivering accountability. This story belongs to this community. Case 9, Ginalys Velazquez-Camara, March 23, 2019, Providence County, Rhode Island. There is a category of case that sits at the intersection of desperation, isolation, and the most fundamental obligations of human care. Cases in which a newborn infant, hours or days old, is abandoned by the person who gave birth to them in circumstances that result in that infant's death. These cases challenge communities and courts. What the grand jury indictment establishes is the legal determination that the choice that was made, abandonment in a basement building without any provision for the infant's survival, constituted criminal negligence resulting in death. The involuntary manslaughter charge is the Providence County grand jury's formal statement that what happened to that baby boy in that Providence basement was a crime, that someone is legally responsible for it, and that the court system will address that responsibility. Rhode Island's safe haven law exists precisely because communities have recognized that desperate circumstances can lead to desperate choices, and that providing a protected, non-punitive alternative to abandonment can save infant lives. If you are aware of someone who is pregnant and in crisis, someone who may be facing a birth without support, without resources, without a safe plan, please connect them with help. In Rhode Island, any hospital emergency room will receive a newborn safely and confidentially under the safe haven law. No questions, no prosecution, just a safe outcome for an infant who deserves to live. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment below. These stories are told so that the people at their center are remembered, and so that the communities that surround them understand what happened and why it matters. Case 10, Lauren Nortz, June 5, 2025, Newport County, Rhode Island. The final case in this Rhode Island documentary is, in certain respects, unlike any of the others. No child lost their life. The outcome, measured in the most essential terms, was not fatal. Because of the extraordinary, heartbreaking, and ultimately life-saving actions of a 10-year-old child who should never have been placed in the position of having to take those actions. The case of Lauren Nortz, arising from events that occurred in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, on June 5, 2025, is a case about what a child did to save an adult's life, and about what law enforcement found when they arrived at that Portsmouth home in response to the emergency call that the child made. Portsmouth is a town in Newport County, Rhode Island, located on the northern portion of Aquidneck Island, the island that also contains the city of Newport and the town of Middletown. It is a community of approximately 17,000 people, characterized by a mix of historic residential neighborhoods, agricultural land, and the waterfront character that defines much of Newport County. It is not a community that regularly appears in the context of child endangerment proceedings. When the events of June 5, 2025 occurred in a Portsmouth home, they brought that community into a set of legal proceedings that reflect one of the most urgent ongoing challenges in child welfare across New England. On June 5, 2025, a 10-year-old child called emergency services to report a medical emergency. The nature of that call, and the action the child had already taken before making it, reflects a level of knowledge about and exposure to the specific medical emergency involved that no 10-year-old child should possess through ordinary childhood experience. The 10-year-old had used Narcan, the brand name for naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal medication, to revive Lauren Nortz, who was in the midst of an active drug overdose. The child had successfully administered the medication. Nortz survived. Let that reality sit for a moment. A 10-year-old child knew what Narcan was. A 10-year-old child had access to it. A 10-year-old child knew how to use it. And a 10-year-old child used it on an adult who was overdosing, and then called 911. That child's knowledge and action saved a life. It also tells an unmistakable story about the environment that child had been living in, an environment in which the presence of opioids and the risk of overdose were sufficiently familiar, sufficiently routine, that a 10-year-old had developed the knowledge and the capacity to respond to it. When law enforcement arrived at the Portsmouth home in response to the 10-year-old's call, what they found expanded the scope of the response from a medical emergency to a criminal investigation. Officers located unsecured narcotics and drug paraphernalia that were, as documented in the subsequent charging documents, scattered throughout the home within easy reach of children. Not secured, not stored safely, not placed in any location or container that would prevent a child from accessing them. Simply present, accessible, and within reach of the children who lived in that home. Lauren Nortz was arrested and charged with child endangerment. The charge reflects the legal determination that maintaining a home in which unsecured narcotics and drug paraphernalia are accessible to children, regardless of whether a specific harm has yet resulted, constitutes criminal conduct under Rhode Island law. Child endangerment charges exist precisely because the law does not require a child to be harmed before the conduct that places them at risk of harm becomes a criminal matter. The risk itself, when it is created deliberately or negligently by an adult responsible for a child's care, is sufficient. This case is the most recent in this documentary, occurring in 2025, which means that the legal proceedings arising from the events of June 5th are either ongoing or recently concluded at the time of this recording. The charge of child endangerment has been filed. The process of accountability is underway. The 10-year-old at the center of this case is not named in this documentary, and their identity is appropriately protected. But their story, the story of a child who learned something no child should have to learn, who did something no child should have to do, and who made a call that saved a life, deserves to be told. Not because it reflects well on the situation, but because it reflects the reality of what children and households affected by the opioid crisis experience and adapt to. They learn to manage crises that adults are supposed to prevent. They develop skills born of necessity rather than curiosity. They carry knowledge that belongs to a world no child should inhabit. Newport County's legal proceedings will determine the specific outcome of the charges against Lauren Nortz. What is already established is that the situation documented in that Portsmouth home on June 5, 2025, the unsecured narcotics, the accessible paraphernalia, the overdose that a 10-year-old had to reverse, was not a safe environment for children. The charges reflect that determination. The court will deliver its accountability in due course. If you or someone you know is struggling with substance use and there are children in the home, please reach out for help today. The SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357 is free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day. Please make that call before a 10-year-old has to make the call for you. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. You have stayed with us through 10 cases, 10 Rhode Island communities, and 10 sets of legal proceedings that reflect both the challenges facing families in crisis and the determination of Rhode Island's courts to deliver accountability when children are placed at risk. 10 cases, 10 sets of legal proceedings across the courts of Rhode Island, Washington County, Kent County, Providence County, and Newport County. 10 situations in which children were placed at risk or lost their lives, and in which the legal system of Rhode Island was asked to respond. 8-year-old girl in North Kingstown whose life ended following a domestic argument over bath time. A 9-year-old adopted child with cerebral palsy in Warwick, left unattended for nearly 8 hours while her seizure medication was withheld. A 2-year-old boy in Pawtucket whose short life was spent in an apartment being used as a narcotics operation. A 6-year-old boy in Pawtucket whose mother exchanged dozens of text messages while he was actively in crisis and did not call for help for more than 12 hours. An 8-month-old infant girl in Coventry who did not survive the environment she was born into. A 10-month-old infant boy in Providence who drowned while his mother was absent and his 9-year-old brother was left responsible for his care. A 7-month-old infant girl in Warwick whose mother recorded video showing the person she was about to leave her daughter with was completely incoherent and left her anyway. 5 children, including a 7-week-old infant found in a Johnston home in conditions that produced 5 felony charges. A newborn baby boy in Providence abandoned in a basement building and discovered days later by a neighbor. And a 10-year-old child in Portsmouth who used Narcan to revive an overdosing adult before calling 911. These are Rhode Island cases. They happened in Rhode Island communities, were investigated by Rhode Island law enforcement, and were prosecuted in Rhode Island courts. They are part of the permanent record of this state, a record that reflects both the challenges communities face and the accountability that courts deliver when children are failed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. If any of these stories has moved you to want to do something, to check on a neighbor, to call a hotline, to share a resource with someone you are worried about, please act on that impulse. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is available right now. So is the SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357. These resources exist because communities decided that children deserve protection and that adults in crisis deserve a path toward help. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary gave you something worth holding on to, please do 3 things right now. Like this video, leave a comment telling us which case you think deserves more public attention, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another episode. We are Cold Case Hour. These stories are real. These children were real. And they deserve every viewer who chooses to pay attention.